If you like Hans Niemann and the London system, then you are going to love this video. Okay, this game just took place in the weekly Title Tuesday tournament, and Hans opens up with the move 1c3. And yes, this really happened. Hans is just trolling his opponent. This is not a good move. But anyway, here we go. His opponent e6. Now after d4, knight f6, we're slowly getting to normal territory. Now knight f3, d5, and finally bishop f4. And despite the weird opening with 1c3, we get some sort of London system on the board. Now here, black has a variety of moves. In the game, he goes bishop d6, simply challenging the bishop on f4 right away. And now Hans has a choice. He can either defend it with the move e3 or attack the bishop or retreat it to the g3 square. Now in the game, he goes e3, and if you're not familiar with the London, this move may look a little bit surprising. I mean, after all, Hans Niemann is just inviting his opponent to give him double pawns with the move bishop takes f4. Then after e takes f4, Hans Niemann will have double pawns for the majority of this game. Now, it turns out this is actually not a problem for Hans Niemann at all. All he would have to do is follow up with bishop d3, knight e5, queen e2, moves like that. And it turns out these double pawns are actually a big asset in the game. They increase his control over the e5 square, and this f-pawn on f4 can actually be a battering ram and push down the board to the f5 square at some point. This is actually a very common pawn structure in the Queen's Gambit declined, and practice shows that it's actually quite good for white. So here, instead of bishop takes f4, black simply castles, getting his king to safety. Now, bishop d3 from white, logical move, and again, black has a choice. Now, here, the best move is actually c7 to c5. The idea is you go c5, then queen c7, then you bring the knight out to either c6 or the d7 square, and at that point, you're putting a lot of pressure on that bishop on f4. It has to do something, perhaps retreat, perhaps trade for the bishop on d6, and then black's in a position where we can actually think about the move e6 to e5, breaking in the center. So overall, the c7 to c5 move would have been the strongest move in the position. Instead, black goes for the move b6. Now, this is another very popular idea in the London as black. The idea is you simply go bishop b7, then perhaps follow up with either knight d7, c5, or knight e. This kind of idea is also very common in the Nimzo Indian for black. However, overall, I'm not as big of a fan of it here. I think it's a little bit more passive, and it's just not as popular at the top GM level right now. Now from here, what does Hans Niemann do as white? Well, he goes queen e2, then after bishop b7, it brings his knight into the game, knight b to d7. And already we're seeing very typical London system development for white. It's already getting very, very dangerous. And in the future, Hans Niemann's going to have a choice. Does he castle kingside, just playing it super safe and solid, or does he think about castling queenside and starting an attack with moves like h4, h5, perhaps g4 to g5, knight e5, and so on? And if you know anything about Hans Niemann, you know this guy is a big attacking player, so of course he's definitely thinking about the move h4 right about now. So in the game, once again, the best move for black is the move c7 to c5. The idea is you're just increasing your control of the center. However, that is not what's played. Instead, black goes for the move knight e4. And the problem with this move is it simply does nothing to stop white's idea of attacking on the king side. And yes, that is what Hans Niemann does here. He starts the attack with the move h4. Boom! Alpha Zero has entered the game. White's idea is simply to push h4 to h5 and maybe even h6 in the future. And this is going to cause weaknesses in the black's king position and also activate the rook on h1. Okay, what the heck is black supposed to do here? Well, he starts knight d7, not a bad idea. And now Hans Niemann jumps forward with the knight g5. This knight is just a monster, and the problem here for black, if you ever take the knight on g5, white can always recapture with the pawn, opening up that h-file for the rook, and you can already see the tremendous amount of pressure on that h7 pawn. That is just so dangerous for black here. So knight g5 on the board, but I gotta say, there was a better way for Hans Niemann to proceed. The big drawback of that move knight e4 is the knight no longer pressures the g4 square. That makes g2 to g4 a distinct possibility. So here, the computer loves the idea of simply castles queenside, and then after any move from black, say queen e7, a normal looking move, then you go g4, starting the g-pawn attack. You push the g-pawns and the h-pawn down the board, and that is just so dangerous for black. But instead, knight g5 on the board right now, and here black proceeds with knight d to f6, simply bringing the other knight over to the king side to help with the defense. A very good and necessary idea. Now, Hans Niemann showing why he is a top grandmaster today. He finds a very difficult move, and that is bishop e5. Now, I'm not exactly a London expert, but this move really surprised me. I would have thought something like long castles here, or perhaps preparing g2 to g4 would have been the move. But instead, bishop e5. What's the idea of this? Well, you're simply increasing the pressure on the knight on f6, and now you have ideas like f2 to f4 in play. And already, it's very difficult to find a good defense for black. Now, in the game, h7 to h6, f6 is played. This is super necessary. Let's say black wastes a move. I don't know. He plays the move a7 to a5. What's the problem with this? Well, here Hans Niemann has a way to win a quick pawn in the middle of the board. The idea is you take the knight on e4. Then after d takes, you take the knight on f6, removing a defender of the e4 pawn. Now, the queen is being attacked. Black has to take back. Queen takes f6, and then you simply take with the knight. Knight takes e4, and you are up a clean pawn. That d5 pawn no longer in the game for black. So that is the idea of this bishop e5 move, increasing the pressure on black's kingside. Now, h6 played. Very good move, simply forcing this knight to do something before white can continue with the idea of bishop takes f6. But now black finds the very critical move h6 as discussed. This prevents Hans from doing that knight d takes e4 idea. Now, the knight is being attacked, but does Hans Niemann have to move the knight? And it turns out the answer is no. The best move here is actually simply castle's queenside, sacrificing the knight. Now, black is attacking the knight on g5 here, but the question is, does white actually have to move the knight? And the answer is no. It turns out Hans Niemann can simply cancel here, ignoring the knight, leaving it up for sacrifice. And of course, that was basically the idea of knight g5 earlier in the game. So here's the proof in the pudding. If black takes, h takes g5, then white simply captures back. And here, white already has extremely dangerous ideas. If the knight retreats to, I don't know, e8 or d7, something like that, then queen h5 is simply going to be game over for black. Of course, the threat is queen h7 or queen h8 checkmate, and yes, there are ways to delay it a little bit, but man, this is just not good. So of course, instead of that, after h takes g5, then h takes, black has to take the pawn on here with the knight, but then white gets his vicious attack going with moves f4 followed by g4, attacking on the king side. His idea is simply to follow up with the move g4 to g5, kicking the knight on f6 out of the way, and from there, the queen's going to have easy access to the king side on h5 or on h2. And this attack here is worth way more than a piece. Obviously, a lot of black's pieces like the bishop and the rook on a8 are simply out of the game for now. Okay, so castle's queenside, that would have been the best move, simply sacrificing the knight on g5. Instead of that, Hans starts bishop takes f6. Of course, this was the idea of bishop e5 on a move earlier. Now he takes the knight on f6, and the follow-up after knight takes is simply f2 to f4. This was the other idea of bishop e5 earlier, clearing the f4 square for the pawn to advance. And now white has this really dangerous idea of g2 to g4, I don't know, moving the knight, and then continuing with the g-pawn all the way to g5, and that hook on h6 is going to be a weakness for black and will be his downfall. Okay, here, black finally starts to get some counterplay on the queen side, c7 and c5. Now, he probably should have played that move. Now, black finally gets some counterplay on the queen side with the move c7 to c5. Whenever you're facing the London, you really got to think about getting this move done earlier in the game to increase that pressure on the center. I mean, if you just give white infinite time, he's going to start a kingside attack with this crazy idea of h4, f4, knight g5, and so on. Now, Hans Niemann continuing the attack, g4. This guy wants to blow his opponent off the board. Now, c takes d4, c takes d4, and rook c8. Not a bad idea at all. The anonymous chess.com player getting the rook on the open c file with the idea of maybe getting counterplay on c2 in the future. And obviously, white's going to have an impossible time castling on the queen side now. So there's a big question. What do you do with the king in the middle of the board? I mean, it's not clear at all if white's king on e1 or black's king on e8 is going to be in more danger as the game progresses. Now, from here, Hans Niemann takes some time to try and square away his king, get it to safety. He starts with the move king f2, but turns out this was not necessary at all. It turns out black really doesn't have any way to attack the king in the short run, and the best idea for white would have been simply continuing with the attack at all costs. Now, here, the computer likes the idea of going queen to g2, then you follow it up with bringing the knight over to the king side, then you follow it up with retreating the knight, and then going g4 to g5 on the next move, and this already is looking super dangerous for black. But instead, king f2 on the board, and here black continues with the idea of going queen c7. However, in this position, black missed a key idea to completely take over the game, and that move is the idea of finally going h takes g5. Now, why is it a good move here and not earlier? Well, it turns out this king on f2 is going to be Hans Niemann's downfall. Here, after h takes g5, black can go knight e4 with check, and that is the difference in this position. That check forces the king to move over a square, and after king g2, black has one extra tempo. And here the best computer line is rook e8, and then after rook h3, simply g7 to g6 from black. And here, I mean, this king on g2 is blocking the queen from getting over to the king side, and of course that g4 pawn prevents any kind of queen h5 idea. So Hans Niemann with this weird king f2 move blocking the queen, then g2 to g4 blocking the queen h5, and suddenly there's the opportunity to take the knight on g5 and take over the game. Now, this is blitz, it's 3 seconds per move plus 1 extra second per move, and it's very understandable why black would have missed this idea of h takes g5 here, but queen c7 on the board. And now Hans Niemann plays an absolutely insane looking move. I really don't know what he was thinking with this at all. I mean, I understand he's way beyond my skill level, but still, Hans, king to g3? What the heck is this move? You're simply lining up the king with the queen and the bishop. That looks suicidal. There's got to be some kind of tactic here to just wipe you off the board. I mean, what the heck is this? And it turns out, yes, that the weird tactic to punish Hans Niemann here does exist, and that move is the absolutely insane e6 to e5. Now, this really is a brilliant move. You're simply throwing your pawn into the strongest point of white's position, and that is the e5 square, and you say, I don't give an F. Bang, e5 on the board. What's the idea? Well, if white takes the pawn, then you sack the bishop. Bishop takes e5. Holy moly, what is this move? Well, the idea after f takes e5, then you recapture with the queen. The queen hits the king with check, and we're already seeing the problem with that weird move king g3 just a couple moves earlier, lining up the king with the queen and the bishop. Of course, there's got to be a tactic, and it does exist. Now, queen takes e5. The king has to run away, but then you simply take the knight that was hanging on prize, and after knight f3 hitting the queen, black can simply retreat to, I don't know, d6 or b8, and here black has simply taken over the game. White's king is way more vulnerable than black's, and white is in deep trouble here. But instead of that, after king g3, black plays the move rook f to e8. Now, this is not necessarily a bad developing move in general, but again, e5 would have been the showstopper move here. Now, Hans Niemann, demonstrating his perspicacity, finally decides to bring the knight back from the g5 square, and yes, it was basically hanging on prize there. Now, how does black proceed? Well, he starts knight e4 check. Again, pointing out the other problem with the move king g3, besides his bishop and queen lining up with the king, you're always going to be vulnerable to knight e4 moves checking the king. Now, Hans takes the knight, black takes back, and Hans jumps forward with the knight to e5. However, we can already see by the eval bar, black is already starting to take over in this game. Now, f6, kicking the knight, and Han plays the very strong move, rook c1. Before moving the knight, he simply activates the rook, hitting the queen, getting that extra tempo for the rook. Now, you may be wondering, wait a minute, what if black just takes the rook on c1? I mean, black can just win the 2 rooks for the queen. Isn't that good for black? And the answer is yes, and the answer is that is exactly what happens in this game. Queen takes c1, rook takes, and now we have an extreme imbalance on the board. Black with the 2 rooks in this position, and Hans Niemann with the queen. Now, I gotta be honest, I am very partial to the queen. I almost never sack my queen for 2 rooks. Whenever I do that, I get blown off the board, but that's what happens when you're only 2,000 online and you try to play against better players. Personally, I never have any luck with the 2 rooks, but in this position in particular, the queen really isn't that active. I mean, there's one open file for the rooks, and the center of the board is simply really blocked with these pawns, and that means the queen is going to be way less active. So this position in particular is simply very good for the rooks, and that means Hans Niemann, my favorite chess player, is in deep trouble in this position. Now, what does Hans Niemann do? Well, he starts by activating the queen. Very good idea. That is the most important piece in this position. You got to get it moving. You got to get it active. And of course, attacking the rook here on e8, black proceeds rook d8, getting the rook out of trouble and defending the bishop against future queen threats. Now, knight g6 from Hans Niemann, trying to activate the knight, and of course, getting out of the way of that f6 pawn. Now, bishop d5 from black, b3 from white, defending a2, and king f7, kicking the knight. The knight has to go somewhere else. And now, both sides play some natural moves, and here Hans Niemann makes a fatal mistake of the game. And it's not obvious why this is a mistake. I'll try to walk you through it. He plays the move king e2. His idea is bringing the king over to the defense of the knight on d2. Of course, the knight was being attacked by the rook, but now after rook takes a2, black has an incredibly dangerous threat. The idea is the move rook a5, and if white wastes a move, I don't know, he plays the move g5, then simply rook a5, and the queen on b5 is trapped. I mean, it does not matter where you go, every single direction, the queen is getting blown off the board. White would be losing on the spot. Oh, poor Hans Niemann. So instead of king e2, the move in this position would have been king e1, simply defending the knight. But now, after rook takes a2, if white wastes a move g5, then rook a5, now white has the e2 and the f1 squares for the queen, and he is perfectly fine. So king e2, the bad move. Now rook takes a2, and white is at a risk of losing his queen. And Hans Niemann, he does not see the idea. He decides to go for it. He goes for it with the move f4 to f5. Now this move lays a trap. If black were to take the pawn on f5, then Hans Niemann takes the bishop. Of course, course, the pawn on e6 was defending the bishop, and the bishop goes as well. So very clever trap by Hans, but the problem with this move, of course, is the move rook a5. And his opponent doesn't find the move. Rook c2. He abandons the idea. And suddenly Hans Niemann is back in the game. Okay, knight h4. He wants to reroute the knight. And in this position, after a few more moves, both players go into this weird draw by repetition. Neither side wants to risk it. And the game ends in a draw. Wow, what a game.